You're listening to the Thoughtful Counselor podcast, created in partnership with Palo Alto University's Division of Continuing and Professional Studies. Learn more at paloaltou.edu/concept. To learn more about our team and find links from each episode, visit thethoughtfulcounselor.com. If you're a fan of the show, we hope you leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you subscribe. Now, on with the show. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Thoughtful Counselor podcast. This is Dr. Stacy Leetom, and I am joined today with my esteemed colleague and dear friend, Dr. Joey Tapia Fusile. Dr. Tapia Fusile, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing wonderful. Thank you for having me.
Certainly. I am so excited to have this conversation with you. You have actually been on my mind since early on in the summer when I taught my human sexuality course and realized that there are a lot of things clinical counselors, marriage and family counselors, sex therapists just have a lot of questions on when it comes to promoting disability responsive care and supporting interabled partners.
Yes, I 100% agree with you. And a lot of that came from my own experiences, feeling like I didn't know a lot in that area or what to do. And so my background is in rehab counseling, so very individual focused. It's holistic in the sense that we look at all aspects of the person, but it was the way we worked was mostly and trained individually. So when it came to couples and family work, I felt I didn't know what to do. And then in looking in the just what was available to me, it was so hard to find resources and support.
I love hearing this perspective of how you got to this place, because I think that so many of us find ourselves in this space of, oh my gosh, I don't feel confident, I don't feel competent to work with this population. And rather than waiting for someone else to do the work, you dove right in and said, this is what I want to learn about. This is what I want one of my areas of expertise to be in. And what an expert you are.
Well, I appreciate the label, but I will say I am a person with knowledge. I struggle with being an expert in most things, but that's my own stuff. But I appreciate that. And truly, yes. And it's interesting when I look back, this was around 2014, 2015, excuse me, where I was working at a post-acute traumatic brain injury facility. And while I felt very comfortable and confident in what I was doing with an individual, I felt very helpless in many ways in how to help a couple and or partners in relationship after something happened. So many cases, it was either an external force, an internal force, so either a stroke or traumatic brain injury of some kind. And there were so many changes to the person's life and so many changes to the family system life. And I I just found myself wanting to understand more, wanting to figure out how do we actually do this therapeutically if we're doing relationship counseling or family therapy.
Oh,
And
wow.
working there were six of us, and with all of our different backgrounds and areas of knowledge and experience, it just seemed like we weren't coming at it from a couples or family lens. It was very much focused on the individual. And so that's what really got me interested in exploring this further, because for over 2 years I heard story after story of just the impact that related to the changes and responding to the disability. All of those pieces, just it seemed important to explore. So that's what pursued me to get my PhD. And I kept in that space. That is an area I grew in. I became trained in emotionally focused therapy. And I said, this is my world. And now what does this look like for interabled relationships? And guess what? In couples literature, there's not much about how to support couples or relationships where there might be a partner with a disability. So I was like, we need to do more.
Yes, absolutely. And I love emotionally focused therapy. Attachment systems and attachment patterns. It's something that once you learn it, you cannot unsee it. You see it
Yes,
everywhere.
yes, everywhere you feel it. Oh, it's so good.
Mhm. So when we talk about disability, I want to do a bit of level setting to make sure that our listeners are all on the same page. So when we use the term disability, to whom are we referring? What kinds of experiences are we referring to?
That's a very good question. And I think so there's going to be a few things I share with this. So in my research, I identified folks with disabilities using the Social Security Administration definition, because those are the folks who are able to get, the services based on the categories that they fall into. Um, so we're talking about emotional, psychological, physical, cognitive limitations, either from birth, either people born with disabilities or people who acquire disabilities in life. In my work, I use the term interabled, and that term comes from a book from Ben Matlin, which I think is a great resource. And it's important to understand that interabled itself is not a catch-all term. It doesn't fit for a lot of folks, a lot of partners where maybe one partner has a disability, and that may not be a label that they utilize. So I think that's important for listeners just to take into consideration that we want to always, check in with the couple, check in with the partners, right? Well, how do they see the relationship? So I think that's just, when we think about language, that's something that I've just continuously worked to figure out. How do we do this from a research standpoint, right? How do we capture voices um, who may identify differently within this community? So yeah.
Yeah, I think it is so critically important to be mindful of the language our clients use. And where some folks really honor that person first language, person with disability, others say, no, like I'm a disabled person first. This is the way that I, see the world. This is the way that I navigate my experiences. And so I think it's really important that you see me as this identity primarily. And it becomes so fundamental to who they are. So thank
Yes.
you for that really important reminder.
Yeah, and no, and you bring up such a good point. Because this is happening, when we talk about when people get, maybe they take a pause because they're not sure what to do or what to say. It's so important that while there may have been a movement to speak from a person first language, that there is also identity first language as well. And just because we may start by addressing someone in person first, being corrected isn't a bad thing. It actually
Mhm.
helps us do better, right? It helps us be more connected to our clients because we get to understand them better. So I think, when folks get caught off guard by that, it's important. That might happen. Language is so nuanced and it is so important to understand what clients and where they're coming from. Because, folks who may acquire disability later in life may not identify as a disabled person, whereas folks who are born with a disability may have a different journey. So we always want to be mindful of those pieces.
So being open and being humble when those nuances happen, and when clients let us know that we've used a language or a term that they don't align with.
Yeah.
So, what are some other challenges that folks may face either with acquired disabilities or within interabled relationships?
Yes. So there's so many layers, right? And it's one of those funny counselor words of it depends.
Mhm.
But some off the bat that come to mind are, when we consider just the age, we always want to consider development in general, right? Development is so vital to how we conceptualize, how we understand where the person is in their life. Um, so part of the development is, if they're in their 30s or 40s and they acquire disability, we do want to understand, what does the family look like right now, right? What does the system look like right now? Are there children involved? Are there partners involved? Um, and when we come at this from a relationship therapy standpoint, what was a relationship like before the disability was acquired? And what is it like right now?
Mhm.
Because oftentimes, unfortunately, although this is not ironed out so clearly in the literature, but there are references to this of just an increased rate of divorce or separation among folks who may acquire disability. And we want to consider the stage of life they're in, because what we know developmentally is folks who are in the aging community, there is an expectation that bodies will change. There's an
Mhm.
expectation that limitations may occur, right, as we age. So those types of relationships are more, for the most part, I don't want to generalize, may able to adapt to and respond to the disability needs within the relationship, because it's an expectation. We know this is coming. Whereas in our society, because of our beliefs around folks with disabilities, it tends to be like, well, that won't happen to me, right? Or, if it does, why me? And there's this almost grief process of loss of access, right? Some folks, depending on kind of what the things that they may experience on a day-to-day basis in terms of change in quality of life or whatnot, they may encounter some additional emotional experiences, and how the relationship responds is so important. Oftentimes what we see is, we have to think of intersecting identities when it comes to like cultural pieces and all those other layers of folks' identity, where if we're talking about a monogamous partner or just dyads that are together, one partner may automatically take on the caregiver role. They may just automatically enter into that space without being asked. No one has said anything. It's just an understood, I love you, I'm here with you. That's what I'm doing. Now, there are limitations to that. And there's an impact if that continues, to where we know in the literature where we talk about caregiver burnout, and it truly depends on the partnership, right? It depends on the needs of the disabled partner or the partner with the disability, and kind of how the other partner kind of steps in to facilitate either needs or whatever or whatnot. Um, so there's levels there. We want to understand that as therapists, right? How much is the non-disabled partner contributing or assisting in day-to-day activities as it relates to their partner with the disabilities daily life? And what are ways that may be creating some additional layers of stress that prevent them from really connecting, right? It becomes more of a I'm caring for you, and the kind of roles that they embody in terms of partners and loving each other and supporting each other, that may shift in terms of balance. And it's a lot for many folks, it's unspoken, where we don't talk about the differences in the balance and the shift. There's this sense of, for many folks, where they don't the for example, the partner with the disability doesn't want to be a burden, right? So they may try to overcompensate by doing certain activities or whatnot, where the non-disabled partner might also not want to say anything because they don't want to hurt their partner. That's often a dynamic that happens. They don't want to say something, that they may be tired or they might be stressed or they might be just exhausted, because they don't want their partner to immediately experience, that sense of it's your fault, right? It's your
Mm.
fault. It's because of you. And that's a lot of internalized messages that are experienced. And I just want to frame this, and this came from my dissertation work too, of this all comes from this ableist society that we live in. These
Mm.
messages that having a disability means you're not quote unquote normal, you're not quote unquote neurotypical, right? And so those messages are just, they evolve it when someone acquires a disability, because those messages are internalized, and often they're unspoken. We don't talk about them. We don't make space for them in relationships. So from a relationship therapy standpoint or counseling standpoint, it's so important that we make space to explore those pieces. How are they making meaning of their experience now? What are they doing to engage and respond to the disability together, not so much just separately and individually, but together? How are they doing this?
Mm. Gosh, you've given our listeners and myself so much to think about and so many different layers to reflect on and roll around in. And I think one of the pieces that stands out to me is this influence of caregiver burnout. And
Mm,
I guess I'm curious, is there a relationship or an association between um, interabled partners where one person is very much a caregiver, and perhaps the how that changes the level of intimacy or sex within those dyads?
yes. So yes, there is. And this is more related to, again, what are they doing for their partner with the disability, right? How much are they contributing? So if I'm thinking of folks who may be, and again, this varies. Every person who acquires a disability may respond to it differently, may adapt differently. So I'm thinking about other cases where there may be more impact to daily activities, quality of life, those pieces where the non-disabled partner may have a bigger role in supporting their partner with a disability. But I'm thinking of situations where there may be a lack of control in bowel and bladder, right? So maybe their non-disabled partner has to step in to assist. I'm thinking about those
Mhm.
that may have to assist with bathing and changing and all those other pieces. Again, I'm speaking my experience and research and area of knowledge and where I'm currently spending my time are folks who acquire disabilities. This might not
Mhm.
be the same case for folks who are born with a disability and who are in a relationship and navigating those experiences. I'm kind of I'm speaking about those who, you know, may not have had this as part of their dynamic and then now it is. We want to consider those differences in lived experience in their journeys of being a human, right? We want to be mindful of those. I'm thinking as we look at folks who acquire disability and are navigating those experiences, a lot of there's some qualitative work that has been looked at to you know, look into the experiences of these relationships. And I will say they're somewhat outdated, I would say. But the stories themselves are very relevant. It's more so when it was published. Where folks may feel like an infant. They may feel like I've
Mhm.
regressed to a baby. My partner's taking care of me, changing me, bathing me, feeding me. And it just their sense of autonomy, their sense of identity shifts in many ways. And sometimes we don't make space to explore that or talk about it because I'm going to tell you this, and it's very important that listeners take this in. We struggle to talk about the uncomfortable. We live
Mm.
in an ableist society. We need to name disability as a phenomenon. It's not, you know, we have folks who like to use differently abled, etc., using other words. No, we need to name what it is. It's a disability. We don't want to erase that narrative. And so I think we have to be comfortable with exploring those pieces. And a lot of the times, especially for example, and I'll go back to the couples or to the dyads, that something that came from my dissertation research as well was therapists were insecure with themselves. They were nervous, they were extra cautious, they didn't want to say the
Mm.
wrong thing, right? All out of care and love. And that meant their actions were different. That meant
Mhm.
they ended up doing something different. They may have went in a different direction. They may have evaded disability in some capacity, and we can't evade it. It is right
Mhm.
in front. It is regard whether we want to believe it or not or sit with it. They're going to navigate this as a relationship. So what is our role in that? Same as we talk about race and same as we talk about other identities, gender, etc. It all plays a role in the relationship dynamics, whether we want to name it or not. And you know,
Mhm.
we do harm when we don't name it and explore it and be comfortable with the uncomfortable. Um, Going back, so yes, this sense of for the partner with the disability feeling like, you know, their identity is compromised, right? Is shifting and changing. And, you know, and again, oftentimes if their non-disabled partner immediately steps in to engages in all these daily activities, um, uh, that might play a role in how they're connecting from a intimacy standpoint. There might not be intimacy for a period of time if both partners are just working to respond to the disability, if they're trying to survive, right, or thrive in this space or adjust truly. So we want to look at that. We want to look at how has their intimacy changed. And again, I think for listeners, I'm sure they know this and they've heard this, but like what kinds of intimacy would they engage in before their disability and what does it look like now?
Mm.
Some of the things we know this, right? We know that diet relationships, folks in relationship often don't like to talk about sex in general. They don't know how to. We live in, depending on where their backgrounds, they may come from a background that it was abstinence focused or whatever the case may be. So sex was something that was not allowed to be discussed or people weren't given language to discuss it. So we want to know that these couples or these relationships also deal with that. And we're adding an extra layer. Think about this. We live in an ableist society. So talking about disability is hard. Talking about disability is uncomfortable for some folks. So add that to a relationship dynamic, they may not know how to talk about it. So it's up to
Mhm.
us to kind of bridge that and make space to talk about it. And sometimes depending on the situation, they may not be ready to, and know that that's okay, right? But that eventually may come up in the work that you're doing with these couples or relationships as well.
Absolutely. So it sounds like there are quite a few different challenges that interabled partners may face, and that those are similar challenges that individuals might face with regardless of the presenting concern. And some of that is just being able to name the challenges, name disability where it lives, talking about issues related to sex, sexuality, and intimacy, and then doing what feels difficult instead of what feels more natural and comfortable, and pushing up against those internalized belief systems of how things are supposed to be, or how I am supposed to be.
Yes. Oh, yes. And yes, and it makes me think of when we talk about just, their role within their sex, sexuality, and intimacy, when we think about those pieces before the disability, what was their role in that, right? How
Mm,
did they engage with each other? And depending on how they engaged or what kind of the experiences that they would have together, how much of that has changed. And because we know this, depending on the type of relationship, they may have had a sense that I have to be the one that engages, or I am the one that does this when we engage in sex or sexuality, intimacy, all those pieces. And when that has shifted, what does that look like, right? What if I can't? I'm thinking of folks who may have a penis, right? What if I can't maintain an erection anymore because of
mhm,
because of an acquired disability? What if that has impacted that? What does that mean, right? And I'm thinking about, I worked with a woman once, and she had vaginismus. But the thing about her vaginismus was it was also tied to her stroke, where it was like a both. It was this interesting process where she was dealing with that, but also half of her body was numb and tight, right? Muscles were tight due to the stroke. So it was painful and also uncomfortable. And also, there was some of it that she would not be able to regain, or at that time in her recovery in that rehab setting. So, how do we explore that with the other partner, right? The non disabled partner? And how do
mhm,
we make conversations around that where it becomes less, you know, I'm pointing my finger, less like it's your fault or we can't do this because of you
mhm,
kind of thing, and it's more collaborative of what can we do and what is new, what can we explore that's new, that's different. And a lot of that again may fall on us to broach those conversations and make space for them, because change is hard when they're dealing with constant change. You have to consider this too when it comes to income and finances. Oftentimes that's impacted as well. They may be navigating new systems of care that they may have not experienced before.
mhm.
Multiple doctors, multiple medications, multiple appointments, maybe surgeries, all these layers that may just be impacting the relationship dynamics, natural, quote unquote, natural flow of what
Mm.
it used to look like. And they have a new flow, right? There's this new experience, and how are we accommodating and incorporating that into their day to day?
I love that. And it sounds like a really wonderful opportunity to kind of celebrate this opportunity to be strength based with our clients and say, how do we find this new exciting way to experience our bodies and experience one another in a sexual way that we didn't do before? Like, how do we make this our own little choose our own adventure? And it's not you versus me, it's you and me together alongside one another as we overcome this disability.
Yes. Oh, oh. And the part to this too that adds a layer when we talk about, depending on the person's identities, again, when we talk about intersecting identities when it comes to this experience, if we're talking about someone who may have these internalized messages about body image, right? And how bodies should look and how bodies should
Mm.
show up, right, in spaces and relationships. If changes occur due to an acquired disability, if thinking about folks who may have additional scars due to surgeries, or bodies may just shift and change due to that, how are we exploring that in a healthy way, in a way where we get to open and talk about it? Because the thing that we don't that some folks may not, again, we want to, there's so much that we do that's so important as counselors, but we want to make space for that. We don't want to ignore that because there's so much stigma around body image and around folks, around people with disabilities, and how when we add those two together and then add gender identity as well, and when we add those together, it creates so for many folks internalized harmful messages about body and about the way that they're showing up in their relationship. And how are we helping them explore that, maybe in an individual but also relationship basis, and
Mhm.
helping them really connect on a different level with themselves, but also with their partner or partners. Um, there was something that came from an article. I'll give you the name of it. I can't remember. Shapiro, I believe, was the. I can't remember the date. Maybe 2015. Where they looked at body mapping as a technique to be utilized within when you're doing like sex-based work or sex therapy work
Mhm.
with dyads or just individuals as well, where they're in front of a mirror and they're naked and they're starting to map out their body. They're starting to pay attention to all the pieces of parts of themselves, whether it's changed or not, and the parts that have changed, making space, kind of being very, it's almost like a mindfulness practice, honestly, of really connecting with yourself, and how that can begin to just it puts you in a space where you have to engage with your own experience, right? What are your thoughts? What are your feelings around as you look at this part of your body? What's coming up for you? As you're looking at this, what's coming up for you? What are you experiencing? How are you sitting with that? And bringing that back to become a good process in therapy, to be had, and also a non-sensual touch exploration. So we do want to help if relationships um, um, either two or more partners, we do want to help bridge some of these gaps, I will say, and maybe their experience that they may not have done prior to. And now they get to, right? Everyone gets to. We all get to do this. But really working to I think the way it was described and the way that I've utilized in practice is they do it in the shower. So we want sensory as well to be part of this in terms of hot, cold, warm, those kinds of experiences. But you want them to be naked. You want them to be in the shower, and you want them to be exploring each other in a um, that it does not have to lead to sex, right? We tell them that
Mhm.
clearly. It's fine if folks get aroused, and that may happen naturally. Um, but we want them to start exploring each other in a way that doesn't force them to go further, right? It's a step-by-step process, especially if bodies have changed, if
Mhm.
functions have changed. We want it to be where we're getting to re-experience each other in a new way.
Yes, yes to all of that. And I have so many thoughts running through my mind, and I just am imagining how powerful these, sensate focus exercises are, where people learn to decouple physical touch and intimacy from sex. And we know that, goal oriented, orgasm driven sex is a huge predictor in sexual dysfunction and disconnect. So, how do
Mhm.
we teach people to just enjoy being in the presence of their partner, enjoying the sensuality and the intimacy and the touch of their partner in a way that's decoupled from expectations of leading to sex?
Yes.
And then the other thought that comes to mind was about that body mapping, and I really love how you described it. And I'm thinking about a client that I had once worked with many years ago who acquired a disability and was using a wheelchair. And a similar exercise they had done that was so powerful. There was a lot of internalized resentment about having to use a wheelchair, a lot of anger at their legs and not being able to use them in the same way that they had previously used them. And so this person looked into the mirror and thought to themselves, well, yes, I'm angry at my legs. I'm angry that I can't use my legs. They're not functioning the way that I would like them to. And yet they walked me down the aisle on my wedding day, which was the most beautiful day of my life. And so there is value in them. And I do have love for them. And I'm now in this place where I get to learn to love them again, and how wonderful and exciting that is. And on
Yeah.
some days it's not. And some days it feels really crummy. And that's okay too.
I love that. Yeah.
So it sounds like a couple of those common myths or stereotypes about disability and interabled partners is that perhaps disability is easy to talk about, we know that that's not the case, or that topics around sexuality are easy to talk about, and that's not the case, or that people can naturally or organically fall into a caregiving space or be able to negotiate roles as a caregiver and then as a lover or as a partner right away. And we know that's not the case. What are some other myths or stereotypes about disability or interabled partners that come up for you in your practice, or maybe that you've even seen in research?
Yes. Oh, all of those, yes, and more. Gosh, there's so many. And it's interesting. So you brought up a case example, so I'm gonna kind of tag along on that, where we know this is both. There's a great book where I'll provide a resource. It's called Visibility: First Person Stories from the 21st Century by Alice Wong. And that book is just wonderful because it's a group of folks of disabled, she labels it disabled voices that are able to speak to their experience without anyone trying to, you know, filter it, modify it, etc. Whatever they may change it to feel quote unquote more comfortable. There, she lays it out. And what I love about the book is and also it's frustrating, right? Because this happens on a day-to-day basis for many folks, is the sense of, I'm speaking to relationships where if a person is using some kind of device, some kind of mobility device or mobility aid, that if they're with a partner, that folks will often address the partner but not them, because somehow they, I don't know, the internalized piece of like, oh, I don't know how to engage with this person with the disability, so I'm going to just turn to the person who quote unquote looks, I hate the word normal, I'm going to use it for this context, quote
Mhm.
unquote, right? So they lock eyes with them, they talk to them, and completely avoid uh, the partner with the disability. And
Mm.
how there's how it's interesting because this happens often, especially, so I, again, rehab background, so often looked at vocational side as well, where the mere piece of a wheelchair, just the wheelchair itself, automatically adds a layer of, well, concerns around cognition. Well, maybe you
Mm.
also have a cognitive disability, when that might not be the case at all. But it's an inherent assumption because of our ableist society that adds these complexities to just social engagements, also employment, also just in general, there's layers of pieces. And the other part to this is um this is, and this I would say maybe a myth will come from this, um is when we consider spaces, our environment is very disabling, our environment is very limiting. I live in Colorado, and my goodness, there are areas where there's 50 steps just to get to one house, honestly. um and how inaccessible that is for many folks. And just, I was exploring some offices, around some counseling offices, and just the lack of access is, it's a little unbearable and upsetting in many ways. And I think just something that comes to mind is to remember, when someone acquires a disability, or in general, maybe we're born with the disability, has had it their whole life, etc. There's additional layers and steps that they have to experience on a day-to-day basis. They have to consider, if I'm going to this place, let's say it's a work group, we're going to go to happy hour afterwards. Well, where are we going? They get the name. They have to do additional research. Is this even accessible? Can I enter this space? Is there going to be inside? Is there a space where I can either situate myself to be comfortable, to be present, to be engaged? And what does that look like? And how often do we not take those things into consideration? And
Mm.
so all those layers, even when they want to seek out mental health services, this was also an additional layer of how we can be responsive to, in general, just I would say it's a universal practice that we can all engage in, is when I know many of you may be on insurance panels, maybe engaging in those kinds of systems. They ask you, is your space accessible? The questions that they may ask are, do you have a ramp? Is there an elevator, etc. Outside of that, you may put that on your website. And how much more detail do you provide? Do you provide the widths of the doorways? Do you provide how many steps there are in general around your building? Are you providing, is your space adjustable, your office space? Some spaces are very, there's not a lot of space to move things. Some folks like to cram their offices and make it look cute, right? But cute also creates some inaccessibility. If I'm thinking
Mm.
about folks with sensory needs, are we considering light options? Do we provide that as an alternative, as an option on our website of options for lighting, options for furniture removal or replacement, or whatever the case is? We often don't explicitly make these things known, and so we're leaving them to have to do more work to figure out, are you someone who can serve me outside of what your areas of knowledge and experiences in, but just your space? Is this a space that can even go?
You just blew my entire mind. Like all of my mind is blown right now. I never thought about even just the width of the doorway and lighting options. And so those are some really powerful examples of best practices. What are some other ones you can think of when it comes to best practices to support interabled partners within relationship settings, family settings, mental health settings?
Yes, yes, all of those pieces. I would say everybody should go start measuring their doorways, start putting this on your website, make it
Mhm.
very clear, help people find you, and know that when they go to you, that you are going to be responsive with their needs. And some other best practices, let's see, there's so many. Let's see, some good tangible ones. Obviously, in your paperwork, it's so important to examine that. Not only, and we should all be looking at our paperwork. I think outside of folks with disabilities in general, just being more inclusive with our paperwork. The thing to remember is, all we operate within an interesting space of, we have a very, for many folks, they have a very medicalized narrative training experience. So they're looking at many aspects of a person through a medical model, right? And we want to know that doesn't necessarily translate well when we're trying to serve folks with disabilities. That is very much pathologizing the idea that they're broken or not, quote unquote, normal, all of those pieces. So we want to be mindful of the language that we are even using to engage, right? And also on our paperwork, what are we asking explicitly? Now, I do recommend adding questions to your paperwork that may be disability related, where it may ask explicitly. We might have something that says, do you identify as having a disability? Yes, blank. What is it, right? Maybe we need to be a little more explicit. What are your needs in a therapeutic setting? What might be something that would make you feel more comfortable in this space? Now, you can also ask that yourself. Great, do that. And we want to know and have a discussion around best fit. Is this space conducive to what you need? And what can you do to advocate or accommodate a potential client that you're trying to serve? And
Hmm.
the important thing here, and I think we get stuck with this because when I often post the question in trainings or teaching or whatever of, when you hear the word disability, what image comes to mind? And the majority of folks will tell me a visible disability comes to mind. They will see an image of either a wheelchair, a cane, a walker, something visible that tells you, quote, the person is different. And so we need to complicate that because there are so many disabilities that are not visible. We are so good at making assumptions about everything. And it's like, it's one of those best practices of, let's remain curious. How about we ask? How about we make space to explore, right? Because it's interesting, we continue to perpetuate these ableist ideals and practices even in our work without even knowing we're doing it. And just being mindful of, what if I just asked and made space to explore differences? What if I broached in the first session and made space to figure out, are there identities within the client that we may not see that they might want to share? And
Hmm.
how powerful that can be for them, knowing that you might be someone different than everyone else out there who views them as someone who is able to access all the things around them, when in reality there might be things that might not be accessible, that might not be, in line with what they're needing.
Wow. So, what I'm hearing you say is how important it is to create space and places for folks to be who they are and to advocate for what our clients need rather than having them tell us. We take ownership, we take initiative and say, not just do you need support, but what support do you need? And am I the right fit for you to get those needs met?
Yeah. And how humbling that is. I think sometimes, again, I've had enough experiences with therapists in the community to speak to this, not generalizing. But and to some, it might be we somehow get in our heads that every client that comes our way, we're going to help them and that's it. We're going to do our best. It's important that, well, yes, you can, and also are you doing things from a responsive space where your ego or your own stuff is getting in the way of doing what's best for the client or clients that you're trying to serve. And the other best practice I'm going to recommend is we are there's so much work that we need to do that we don't do. The self of the therapist is essential to doing quality work. My goodness, I have chills in my body because it's so upsetting and yet exciting, and yet there's space for it, and yet we don't do it in many cases. Where another piece that came from my dissertation was this around self of the therapist and the need to explore what am I holding on to around folks with disabilities. I don't care if you've seen a client with a disability or not. You should still explore this, because how are you contributing to this ableist mindset, this ableist ideals in our society? Sit with it, right? How am I contributing to this, or how am I upholding these practices? So being able to sit with yourself, examine where did we get these messages, right? Of them being different, them being not normal, them being um, different, or all those pieces. And there's a lot of that has to do with our early upbringing and within our social context. So if we consider what if I have seen this myself, I know it has been shared before and identified as something that can be harmful, is where children may be curious around seeing someone with a disability. They might point or they might ask questions, and the caregiver, often caregiver parent, whoever is maybe with them, may be like, shh, no, 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 we don't ask,
Mm,
don't point. And we stop their curiosity in that moment, furthering signaling that something is wrong or different. We want to encourage that curiosity, right? We want to explain to them there are people who may look different from us, and they're just like us. They're people too, right? They're navigating the world a little differently. And a lot of that ends up stopping because we are super uncomfortable with it, because we somehow silo them. And I want you to consider two educational settings. What have you been exposed to? I know for me, in my K through 12 experiences, folks with disabilities were often, I would say, more visible disabilities. Because for non-visible disabilities, I wouldn't necessarily know around me. They were separated, right? They were either in special education or other forms of class settings outside of mainstream classrooms.
mm,
So again, what messages are you internalizing from that? Are you engaging? Do you have friends who growing up that had a disability, and what were the kind of conversations around there? This happens so much, and it's very upsetting. And I'm going to recommend this book as well. It's called In Sickness and in Health: Love, Disability, and a Quest to Understand the Perils and Pleasures of Interabled Romance. And that's by Ben Matlin. And he gathered a bunch of stories. He was born with a disability himself, but he gathered a bunch of stories from interabled relationships. And the narrative that often also gets communicated is, if a non-disabled person decides to date, and then the person happens to have a disability, the messages communicated within family are so harmful and complicated.
mm,
So it's important that when we talk about what messages are we sitting with, we have to explore them. How are we comfortable? Are we comfortable with even the word disability? I had a participant in my study say that they didn't like the word disability because it was deficit in itself. It was a deficit in itself.
mm,
Well, you would view that if that's how you're contextualizing disability in our society. We're in an ableist um, society. So yes, it's gonna the word disability, many folks are gonna try to, you know, move away from. And so yes, I think there's so much that we can do and sit with ourselves before we do more. We have to start with us.
mm. Wow. I'm so glad you mentioned the dating part, because I
Mhm.
find that when I am speaking with folks who are disabled and they're dating, some of those myths and stereotypes that come up are around the hypersexuality or asexuality of disabled folks.
Yes. Yes.
Is that something you've seen as well, either in your research or in your clinical work? And can I just tell you how frustrating it is that we don't yet have sex toys that honor the like manual dexterity or challenges of folks who either have a difficult time with grip strength or flexing or different things like that. And I recently just saw one sex toy for penis owners that is really incredible and is able to help folks achieve an orgasm without an erection. And I can link that as well to the landing page. But I'm curious for your thoughts on that.
Yes. Oh, so many problems there, right? And so many problems around those pieces of just one access to other forms of pleasure. And it's again, when we consider examples, I grew up in Texas and it was very abstinence based. I didn't really do sex ed. I don't know. I didn't know what sex was. No, I'm just kidding. I knew, but in depth, I didn't really understand all those pieces. And as a gay man, I was like, much less even, I knew nothing. It was into my mid 20s where I was like, okay, I know a little bit more and I'm still learning,
Mm,
right? And it's our society's view around sexuality related to different folks. So I'm thinking about just like our queer folks with disabilities and how they get inundated with information around sexuality, sex, and pleasure, all of those pieces. And they don't. That's the piece, is they don't. And it's frustrating because a lot of our programs don't even provide examples or resources for what does it look like if you have a disability, right? What does this
mhm,
look like if you want to engage in pleasure? And are there different ways? Are there and just the images? Consider not only the language that's used, case examples or vignettes or whatever you want to call them, but also images. And they're often not depicted as having a disability. So who are they? Who is being reflected in those experiences, right? And they're mainly white folks. So we want to know that there's limitations to that. So again, when we're looking at if we're working with interabled relationships, we want to explore their pieces of understanding, like how did you learn about sex, or what does sex look like to you? What does it mean to you, right? Or pleasure, all we want to understand those pieces and not be scared of them. The common thing I will say this, and I'll go back, is I hear a lot of couples therapists or relationship therapists say, "Well, I'm not a sex therapist." Well, you don't have to be. Get trained in sex therapy, do
mhm,
a training, do something, understand that
mhm,
they're integrated. My goodness, that's not an excuse. That's late. I don't want to say that's laziness, excuse me. But that's an excuse. You
mhm,
have work to do. We all have work to do. People are paying us money to come and get support. And for us to be like, it's not what I do. It's not okay. The other piece to that is, yes, the other part is when we're talking about pleasure and we are providing folks resources to get to go look and explore things, we need to know that if I'm going to send someone somewhere, I need to do my research first. Do they have any adaptable or disability responsive or sensitive toys that
mhm,
are applicable or apply to them? If I'm going to send someone somewhere and they find things that don't fit them in terms of something that they can even utilize, what is that communicating to them? Harmful. So we want to do our work. We have so much work to do ourselves, and it's not a bad thing. My goodness, that's part of lifelong learners. We never arrive. We're constantly learning and engaging. And something that you mentioned that's so important is there's so many limitations and lack of resources and opportunities. And it just speaks to the what is left to do around this.
mhm. I'm so glad you mentioned that just because people don't identify as a sex therapist, that they can't work with sexuality based issues in counseling. That is like one of my things that I hope we can begin to deconstruct as counselor educators. And it sounds like the work you do touches on these three pieces that I firmly believe, if we can get really, if we can commit to continuing to learn more about these three topics, we can work with just about any client. And it is attachment, trauma, and sex.
Yes.
Like those are the things, right? Like when I think about all my clients, those are the things that continue to come up regardless of who you
Mm.
are, where you're from, what your experiences are. None of us escape adolescence or adult life without trauma. All of
Right.
us have attachment issues. Thanks, family of origin. And all of us continue to struggle with the fact that good sex is our birthright and we are deserving of pleasure, intimacy, love, and kindness. And yet, so many barriers exist to keep us from achieving true um, actualization around one or more of those areas.
Mhm.
So I love hearing about your work with attachment, and I love hearing about your work with sexuality and supporting interabled couples. And I know you've mentioned quite a few resources already, but are there other ones that come to mind? And I'll make sure to link all of these as well on the landing page. What are some of the best resources, or even just your favorite ones, that come to mind when you think about how to prepare counselors to work with interabled partners or clients with disabilities?
Yes, so there's a few. Those two books are two of my favorites because again, and I am speaking to you as a non-disabled person. So I am mindful of my positionality in my work, and it is so important. I'm constantly engaging in that because I can't evade that. It's a reality, right? And so these two resources are coming from disabled voices. It's so important that we are making space to take in, hear, and listen to disabled voices. So these two books are, to me, foundational in just engaging with the realities of what may be quote unquote unspoken. There are a few podcasts that I really like. One of them is called Disability After Dark, shining a bright light on disability stories. So important. So that is a great one to engage in. And the other one is by Alice Wong herself, who gathered and published the Disability Visibility book. And it's called Disability Visibility, and it is available. It's around politics, culture, and media. So that's another one to engage in. And that's just a way to sit with, explore, listen to voices, hear them, right? What are they saying? How am I contributing or upholding these practices or beliefs? Because guess what? We all do. We're not free from it. Whether we've explored it or not, it's a reality. And we can't keep doing the status quo. We really can't. It's so harmful. There are 26 people, 26, excuse me, not 26, 26% of Americans identify as having a disability, and that comes from the CDC. So that's a large group of folks in our community. The idea, if you're hearing this and you're saying, well, I don't work with anyone with a disability, lies, I'm going to tell you. You might not think it, right? They may not have shared it. And it's important when we don't broach from the beginning, they may not know this is a space to talk about it. There have been so many harmful therapists out there, and yes, harmful therapists, you are out there, where there have been moments where there was a great presentation I attended at ACA, the American Counseling Association, in New Orleans, excuse me, in Atlanta. This must have been 2018, where there were stories being shared, and one of them was around. They were all therapist related in terms of therapist responses to clients with disabilities. And there was a client who was traveling abroad, and they had a physical disability, and the therapist looked at them and said, "Well, how are you going to do that?" Right? Isn't that interesting?
Oh,
There's much more harmful messages that are communicated, much more questioning than you would, much more questioning out of your own lack of knowledge and awareness. So it's important that being curious and open is different than you being not you're not doing your own work outside. Similar when we talk about other clients with identities, you have to do your own homework. Don't put it on the client to do it for you. It is important to remain curious, to understand their lived experience and to understand how that ties to their overall presenting concerns or issues or whatnot. And it is not their job to teach you about disability. My goodness, if
mhm.
you're doing that right now, stop. I just gave you resources. Use them, please.
I love those resources. And yes, there is so much space for counselors and therapists to do our own work. Otherwise, we are going to be hurting the people who are looking to us for care. And, if you're listening to this and you're a counselor, then I'm sure you yourself have heard stories of clients who, have come to you after other counselors who said some really harmful things, or who have expected clients to teach them about what it means to be, X, Y, or Z. So a couple examples that Dr. Tapia Fusele has described to increase our competency to work with inner-able partners include two of those fantastic podcasts. There are quite a few books, but also just to be curious and to continue doing the work to learn about cultural competence in all of its forms and all of its identities.
And for my counselor educators out there, let me tell you. So I reviewed four accreditation bodies: social work, psychology, clinical mental health. Um, and it is important that you hear this. Our standards, okay, I know we're going to get, for those of you in K-CURE programs like myself, yes, standards will be coming out. The current ones that are listed, what outside in non-rehabilitation counseling programs, the disability content that's covered in most programs is scary in terms of how it's not covered. It might be
Mm.
covered in a chapter in 1 week in a course. We need to be incorporating disability in everything we do. It's so bananas when we think about it, because we often talk about multicultural competence. Often the folks that are left out are those with disabilities in those conversations. Now, it is so important we consider race. Yes, it is so important we consider gender. Yes, it's so important we consider all those pieces, and how we are considering disability in that equation. And on top of that, there are so many wonderful books that are nicely paired to the other textbooks you may be using. For example, in my human growth class, we have a standard book that has been used for teaching folks about human growth and development, and it's limiting as hell when it comes to talking about disability. So I added a textbook. It's from Julie Smart, and it's Disability Across the Lifespan. Wonderful addition because it covers the gaps that aren't covered in that book. You can do this. You can do those articles. You can do this so many ways. If you are uncomfortable talking about it, figure it out, because you're an educator. You need to do something. Get Call me. I'm happy to come to your class and talk about this. We can't evade it. We Just because we don't have the experience doesn't mean we get the opportunity to evade the topic around disability, because
Yes.
it happens regardless if it is an acquired or someone who's born with, or someone who may in the aging community. It will happen. We need to get comfortable with it. We need to get into a space of understanding, right, and exploration, and also unlearning and relearning ableist practices and more responsive practices for disability folks.
Oh my goodness. I'm holding all of you listeners accountable. Counselor educators, you are being held accountable. This is our journey. This is our role. This is our work. And we have been positioned with this incredible opportunity to educate people, future counselors, and to support clients who are working through this, navigating this lived experience every day. So, what are you doing today that's empowering you to be your best self tomorrow?
Hmm.
Are there other pieces of advice for our listeners? I know you've left us with quite a lot of nuggets to think about and roll around in, but are there other final thoughts that you have rolling around in your own mind?
Yes. Always, right? When it comes to this topic, I'm so passionate about it, about serving this community. Uh, the thing I would recommend is a reality for many folks. If you're coupled, if you're in a relationship, um, and have one or more partners, the question we rarely talk to each other about is, what would happen if something changed with us? Like if my body changed, if my daily functions changed, how would we respond to this? And it's one of those things where younger couples and middle-aged couples, when I'm looking at my folks in my 20s, or relationships, all relationships, people in their 20s, people in their 30s, it's seen as like it can't happen to me kind of similarly when we think about death or whatnot. It's one of those things where we avoid at all cost. But related to disability, it's a reality, right? It can happen, and it can happen at any time, and it's not up, and how are we going to respond to that in relationship? And I think that can be a nice foundational question that you you can start exploring yourself and really having a dialogue around it. So that way you can figure out, oh, wow, there's so much that we didn't necessarily know or think about of how might we respond to this. If you have children, if you have pets, right? All your loved ones, how are we respond? How can we respond and support each other? What things might you be able to consider in terms of having, other forms of insurance like long-term, short-term disability, those kinds of pieces that might support financial changes if it occurs, and as well as access. If you have access to um, I guess the other disparity part, right, for some folks. But if you have access to healthcare, what does that look like? Would you get provided an aide, someone to provide care for you that can lift some of the responsibilities from maybe a partner that may take those on, that might provide some ability for you for the dynamic of relationship to continue or adjust in a different way. So you want to be considering those things. I want you to be curious with yourself, please, and be curious with clients. But I think that's just a nice way to start. Talk to your partner or partners about it.
Definitely some good pieces of advice for our listeners. And how can listeners get in touch with you if they want to learn more or get in contact?
Yes. So you can reach me at my email. I'm at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs in the Counseling and Human Services Department. My email is jtapia, T as in Tom, A as in Apple, P as in Paul, IA, F as in Frank, U, at uccs.edu. And yeah, I'm happy to, if you email me, I'm always quick to respond. So happy to engage.
Wonderful. Well, this has been an absolutely illuminating conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on the Thoughtful Counselor podcast. And I look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you.
The Thoughtful Counselor is
Dasa Daniel,
Raisa Miller,
Aaron Smith,
Jessica Tyler,
Stacy Diane Aranez Ulitam,
and me, Megan Speciale. Find us online at thethoughtfulcounselor.com. Our funding is provided by Palo Alto University's Division of Continuing and Professional Studies. Learn more about them at paloaltou.edu/concept. The views and opinions expressed on The Thoughtful Counselor are those of the individual authors and contributors and don't necessarily represent the views of other authors and contributors, nor of our sponsor, Palo Alto University. So if you have an idea for an episode, general feedback about the podcast, or just want to reach out to us, please drop us a line at thethoughtfulcounselor@gmail.com. Thanks for tuning in, and we hope to hear from you soon.